You guys, thanks so much for joining me. Thanks for listening and meeting my daughter through this story. I hope that it makes you feel less alone if you're going through loss as well. And I hope that it glorifies the Lord. Those are my two prayers. I already shared the story of how we lost our son Judah. I can link that video down below. We had lost him the year before. It had been a long time of, I would say, trying to conceive. We never took like ovulation tests. We weren't preventing and we were trying. But our doctor had said it takes the average healthy couple even a year to conceive, and that he wouldn't be concerned unless it had been more than a year. And so we went into it knowing that it could be a long time. But Judah he wasn't a honeymoon baby, because we didn't conceive till we'd been married for a month, maybe 6 weeks or 8, somewhere in there, a month to 2 months. And so I thought it would be fast. No, it was 2 months after we got married. So I thought it would be fast. Anyway, all that to say. And it was not. We had a whole year, and that year was so hard. Constantly knowing you're ovulating and trying not to let it make you feel pressured, but just to let things continue to feel natural. And then at the same time knowing, get my cycle in 2 weeks, like, when can I test? But then we were living abroad and I did not have very many pregnancy tests. This was before the days of being able to just buy in bulk off Amazon. I would have done that if it was an option, and it wasn't back then. Anyway, not that it's been that long, but those tests have not been on there for very long. And I, with living abroad, couldn't have gotten them anyway. So we were trying, and we were going into it with grief. And I think that complicated things, because I knew getting pregnant would not replace Judah. That was never, ever a factor. But I was like, but if I could grieve him while no longer grieving an empty womb and empty arms, that would be helpful. If I could just grieve him while knowing I'm no longer empty, that would be helpful. And it took a year. And I think that year grew my faith a lot, grew my marriage a lot. And ultimately, I'm thankful for that year, which is surprising. I actually never thought I would say that, but I am. So we finally got pregnant. I had some symptoms very early. I don't know if I ovulated early that month. Again, like I said, we weren't tracking ovulation, but I had some symptoms early. And so I pulled out one of my tests. It was just a cheap dollar store test. And this was 4 days before my period was supposed to start, and it was positive. And so I pulled out one of my pink tests, the standard, pink dye tests, because the dollar store ones, yes, they're cheap. If you test positive on one of those, you are pregnant. But I have heard that with blue dye in particular, it can bleed and give you a false positive. And after our history of loss, that was not something I wanted to experience. So this test was purple dye, and I wanted to be sure. So I took one with that pink test, and it was also positive. And that was amazing. I was overjoyed. I was thrilled. I remember feeling such thankfulness and such joy, and as though I was glowing, as though I just had this warm light just emanating from within me, just utter thankfulness, utter joy. I remember going shopping at the grocery store and just walking around thinking, no one knows, but I'm pregnant. And it was as though I thought they could see it by just looking at me, as though the shine on my countenance would say, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant. And I just kept thinking, hello, little lovey, hello, like, hello, little lovey, hello, to my womb, to my stomach. And just thinking from the beginning, I think this is a girl. I think this is a girl. And of course, we were too early to know, but I choose to believe that was true. And whether or not I'm wrong in the grand scheme of eternity, it will not matter. But yeah, she was my daughter. I was elated. I was thrilled. There was no part of me that thought this will happen again. So we had our son Judah in the United States. By this point, we were living abroad, and healthcare where we were living, it did not determine the fact that we miscarried, but it did make it harder. So I had found, I'm a nurse, and I had a doctor that I worked with from the same area. And he said, oh, someone I went to medical school with is a doctor there. He's an OBGYN. And this was before I was pregnant. So I just tucked that information away, and then ultimately did have to call him at one point to get a recommendation for a general practice. This is before I was married, before children. But then once I did get pregnant, I was like, oh my goodness, I know exactly who to call. So I called this OBGYN, and his specialty was IVF and IVF pregnancies. And though I was not an IVF pregnancy, IVF pregnancies are much higher risk. And because I was coming at it having lost Judah well beyond the normal stage of a miscarriage, I thought, okay, I'm not technically high risk, but I want to see an high risk OB. And so he was perfect, and he was a believer, which was really nice. And so I was thrilled to have found him, and I communicated with him. I've had 2 positive pregnancy tests, and he said, okay, my first step would be, I'd like you to go to this hospital and get an HCG draw and also a progesterone draw. So I drove to that hospital and got my labs drawn, and then went and ran some errands. Originally, I was just thinking to go home, but my husband was working anyway. He was meeting with some people, and so I went back to the clinic later by myself, which I ultimately regretted, and got my HCG results. Again, this is where some of the overseas healthcare comes into play. I walked into the hallway, and they were like, this window is where you'll get your results. I'd gotten a phone call. They told me where to go, gotten my ticket, walked down that hallway, and there are other people there waiting for their results. And the man said, you're here for an HCG draw, a pregnancy test? And I was just like, why is he telling everyone in the hallway what I'm here for? And then he handed me an envelope that was not sealed anymore. He had opened it and read it. And he said, it's negative. You're not pregnant. And I wish I had said, I am. I had 2 positive pregnancy tests. But it was as though he knocked the air out of me. I remember as a little girl, one time I fell from a swing right on my back, and I just felt just this like big exhale, and then I couldn't breathe. Like, it just took a long time before I could breathe. And my brother had said my lips turned blue, so he ran and got my mom. It felt like that. Like, it felt like all the air had just been just knocked out of me, and I couldn't take a breath to respond. So I left. I went and hid in the bathroom, and I read that piece of paper, and my HCG levels were nil. They were so low. So I got in the transport to go back home, and couldn't even reply to my husband's text because he was waiting to know if the numbers were good. And to give you some clarification, maybe, HCG, the first test, isn't ultimately that big of a deal. You wait to see if it doubles in 24 to 72 hours, or 48 to 72 hours. That's the big thing with HCG. You just want to know in those early stages, those early weeks of pregnancy, is it doubling in 2 to 3 days? So this was the first draw, and that one a few days later was going to be the more important draw, which is why I felt fine to go alone. So I showed up at our flat, and he opened the door, and I melted into his arms and wept, and he knew what that meant. So I showed him the paper, and we let our doctor know, and he said, okay, why don't we get you in to the clinic for an ultrasound in a week or 2. With Judah, after I delivered him at home, we went to the hospital because I was hemorrhaging, and ultimately couldn't stop bleeding. So they did an ultrasound, and I retained the placenta. So I ended up having to have an emergency D&C. The It's all on that video. And so that's part of what his mindset was. He didn't want me to have any retained products. He wanted to make sure that this didn't affect my health long term, which is great. So I was wrecked and just kept thinking, how could this impossible, earth-shaking pain happen twice? Why would God let it happen twice? And it really caused this just, not crises in my faith, but I was definitely wrestling with the Lord. I was definitely making my complaints known to him. And Lamentations really ministered to me in that time, just pouring my heart out before the Lord, letting him hear all my thoughts. He knows them anyway. I might as well pour them out before him. And then just him sitting with me in my grief, in that comforting silence of a comrade who's also had his heart pierced, who's known the worst of pain and rejection and betrayal. Who better to understand my pain? So I eventually really felt like the Lord answered my questions and gave me hope. But it was a dark time. And ironically, I started bleeding on Thanksgiving Day. And it felt like everyone was coming to the table to feast and to celebrate. And I was in a famine. I was in the desert. I was desolate. We're celebrating gathering and abundance while I am empty and alone. And that was really hard. So I don't talk about this story much. I talk about Judah's. Our sons know about their older brother in heaven, but I don't often talk about Abigail's miscarriage, which is what we ended up naming the baby. So forgive me for crying. But we decided to name the baby Abigail Kathleen, just leaning into that motherly intuition that said it was a girl. And Abigail means a father's joy, and Kathleen is my name. So we were giving the baby a little bit of us both. With our firstborn son, we named him Judah Paul. Judah after a dream that I had had, and then Paul, my husband's Pablo. So Judah Pablo was technically the name, but in the end we chose to put Judah Paul on the headstone. But we always had referred to him as baby Judah. And we just, by that act, wanted to say that they are worthy to be our namesake, though they did nothing on the earth. They are worthy of our love, though they did nothing on earth to earn it. My 3 and 5-year-old can really test my patience sometimes, but they have all of my love and all of my heart. They are my greatest joy, and they don't have to earn that. They deserve that love. They have that love because they are my child. Like God, we have his love just because we are his child. And so I wanted to name Abigail after me, even though I was forsaking my ability to pass my name on again, because she earned it simply by being my child. Pablo got to pass his name on to Judah simply because Judah was our firstborn son. And that will never change. I never want to use those names again. Our children, we anointed our children with those names intentionally. So we named her Abigail Kathleen. And then I went to the clinic for the ultrasound. And this is part 2 of the second little experience with medical care overseas. I know that this person did this with a loving intent, though. So let me preface it by saying that. We went to the doctor's office. It was dirty and dark and hot and very small. The type of clinic where you have to bring your own drinking water because it's the water is non-potable, like you can't drink it. And as we walk in, he has babies, fetuses of different stages of gestation in jars, like studied. And so you're walking into your appointment past these deceased babies in jars, and it's just so hard. It's so hard. So I go in, and for privacy's sake, a woman is giving me the ultrasound, and she is an OB by every right, but because of the country, they really prefer doctors to be men, which is sad. So her job was to be his assistant, even though she was a doctor in her own right. And he made sure to tell us that. He respected her, and he treated her very well. So she and I are behind a curtain. She's giving me the ultrasound, and he can see the computer with my husband. And they did try to like show me bits of it, but she's giving me the ultrasound, and she gives me a thumbs up, and she says, "Empty, empty." And she meant it to be comforting because I didn't need a DNC. But you can imagine what it felt like to have that word spoken over me. And that was very hard. She meant it well. And I remind myself of that. So we clung to God's word. There's a chapter in Isaiah that we really clung to. I'll put the verse on the screen. And we prayed into that. And I remember as I was laying there getting the ultrasound, the Lord said, "She's proving that you're empty, so that the world may know that I'm the one who filled you." And 2 weeks later, I ovulated. And we conceived our son, Oliver, who is now 5.5. We found out obviously a full month after that. But I just like to remember that technically ovulation's 2 weeks later. Technically, I only had 2 weeks to wait for the fulfillment. Sorry, technically I only had 2 weeks to wait for the fulfillment of that promise. Technically, I'd waited well over a year by the time this had all happened. But 2 weeks from the moment he spoke that over me at that ultrasound appointment. And that is profound. That is a miracle. I did end up having some preterm labor with Oliver and with our surprise baby, Santiago, who is now 3.5. I'm going to end this here. I think it's getting kind of long, but I do hope to tell more about Oliver's pregnancy being my rainbow baby and Santiago's pregnancy being my my surprise baby, and just how God answered our prayers and gave us supernatural births. I mean, supernatural. He was in the room while I labored and gave me a fast and painless labor. 100%. It's amazing. So I don't want to end this story on a bad note. There was hope, there was answered promise, and our rainbow came. Praise God. But yeah, every Thanksgiving, I remember my Abigail Kathleen. We have a memorial ornament for Judah on the tree that says, like his name and birthday. And then for Abigail, I have a fall leaf that's been dipped in gold to preserve it, because she's my little Thanksgiving baby. She's my fallen fall leaf, preserved forever in gold, waiting for me in eternity. But thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it so much. Thanks for meeting my daughter today. Bye-bye.